Imagine waking up tomorrow to discover that an entire continent has been erased from every map, every textbook, every official record, as if it never existed. Not through war, not through natural disaster, but through something far more sinister: deliberate erasure. Now imagine that this is not a hypothetical scenario. It already happened, and the evidence has been hiding in plain sight for over a century. This is the story of Tartaria, a colossal empire that once dominated the maps of the known world, stretching from the Caspian Sea to the Pacific Ocean, encompassing vast territories across 3 continents. For more than 300 years, from the 1500s through the 1800s, cartographers across Europe meticulously documented this empire. French mapmakers, Dutch explorers, German geographers, British navigators, all of them working independently, separated by borders and sometimes bitter rivalries, agreed on one undeniable fact: Tartaria was real. It was massive, and it mattered. These were not crude sketches or vague approximations. These were detailed, professional maps showing precise boundaries, distinct regions, and sophisticated political divisions. Independent Tartary, Chinese Tartary, Russian Tartary, Great Tartary. Each region carefully delineated, each border thoughtfully drawn. The consistency is staggering. Why would cartographers from competing nations, who could not even agree on their own territorial disputes, unanimously document an empire that supposedly never existed? But here is where the story turns dark. Somewhere around the middle of the 1800s, something extraordinary happened. Tartaria vanished. Not gradually, not through conquest or collapse, but overnight, erased from the historical record as if by decree. Modern atlases published after 1850 show no trace of it. History textbooks dismiss it as a vague geographical term for unknown lands inhabited by nomadic horsemen. Wikipedia will tell you it was just a catch-all name for the peoples of Central Asia, Mongols, Turks, wandering tribes with no cities, no empire, no lasting civilization. Yet this explanation crumbles under the slightest scrutiny. If Tartaria was merely a label for unexplored wilderness, why the meticulous borders? Why the subdivisions into multiple territories? Why would maps from 1706 show the same boundaries as maps from 1780, drawn by cartographers who never met, working in different countries, consulting different sources? The official narrative asks us to believe that hundreds of professional mapmakers across 3 centuries all made the same mistake, or worse, all participated in the same fantasy. And then there is the physical evidence. Walk through the streets of Seattle, and you will find entire city blocks buried underground. Not metaphorically buried, actually buried. First-floor windows that now peer up from basements, ornate doorways that open into dirt, sidewalks built on top of what were once second stories. The official explanation blames the Great Fire of 1889, followed by urban renewal projects that raised the street level. But this does not explain the uniform depth of burial. It does not explain the sophisticated architecture hidden below, stonework too precise, facades too elaborate for what should have been hastily constructed pioneer buildings. The pattern repeats across America. Chicago, after the fire of 1871, raised its streets 4 to 8 feet, but excavations reveal not one buried layer, but 3 distinct strata of construction, each showing signs of catastrophic burial. New York subway workers, digging through Manhattan bedrock in the early 1900s, uncovered vaulted ceilings 40 feet underground, complete with detailed masonry that no one can explain. San Francisco, Salt Lake City, Edinburgh, Paris, St. Petersburg, Samarkand, Beijing, cities across the globe, all showing the same anomaly. Buildings half swallowed by earth, buried so uniformly it suggests not gradual sinking, but a single devastating event. What kind of catastrophe could bury entire cities across multiple continents in a relatively short span of time? And what kind of power could ensure that this event, along with the empire it destroyed, would be systematically deleted from human memory? The questions multiply the deeper you dig, literally and figuratively. If Tartaria was just a myth, why do Russian archives contain census data from the 1780s documenting populations in Great Tartary? Why do Vatican records include diplomatic correspondence addressed to the Tartarian Khan in the 1690s? Why would the British East India Company maintain trade records with Tartarian merchants if no such empire existed? Before we go further into this labyrinth of buried truths and erased histories, I want to take a moment to introduce myself. I am Mr. H, and if you are drawn to mysteries that challenge everything we have been taught, If you find yourself questioning the official narratives that never quite add up, then you are in the right place. This channel exists for seekers, people who refuse to accept convenient lies when uncomfortable truths are staring us in the face. If that resonates with you, consider subscribing and turning on notifications, because what we are about to uncover together goes far beyond a single forgotten empire. This is about understanding how history itself can be weaponized, how entire civilizations can be erased, and why the powers that orchestrated this deletion might be preparing to do it again. Now, back to the evidence that refuses to stay buried. The ground beneath our feet holds secrets that could shatter everything we think we know about our past and our future. Let us start with something undeniable: the maps. Not rumors, not hearsay, not dubious claims from internet forums, actual historical documents created by the most respected geographers of their time, housed in national archives, libraries, and museums around the world. These maps tell a story that modern academia desperately wants to ignore. In 1706, French cartographer Guillaume Delisle, royal geographer to King Louis XIV, published a comprehensive atlas of Asia. Delisle was no amateur. He revolutionized mapmaking by insisting on astronomical observations and mathematical precision rather than relying on travelers' tales. His maps became the gold standard across Europe, and there, covering the vast interior of northern Asia, he clearly labeled Tartary, an immense territory that dwarfed the nations of Western Europe combined. 29 years earlier, in 1677, Frederick de Witt, one of Amsterdam's premier cartographers, had produced his own map of Tartaria. The Dutch, at the height of their maritime empire, needed accurate maps for trade and navigation. Their economic survival depended on cartographic precision. De Witt's map showed not just one Tartaria, but carefully distinguished between different regions: Great Tartary in the north, Chinese Tartary to the east, and independent Tartary, spanning the central steppes. These were not vague designations. They represented distinct political entities with defined borders. Travel back further to 1635, and we find Joan Bleu, another Dutch master, producing maps that show Tartaria as an established empire with cities, trade routes, and territorial divisions. The Bleu family workshop was legendary for its accuracy. Their atlases cost a fortune, equivalent to the price of a house, because wealthy merchants and nobles knew these maps could be trusted. They staked their fortunes on this information. Would they pay such prices for fantasy? Cross the border into Germany, and we encounter Johann Baptist Homann, official geographer to the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1716, Homann published detailed maps of Tartary that aligned with the Dutch and French versions. Different languages, different patrons, different political interests, yet the same empire, the same boundaries, the same subdivisions. This is not the behavior of mapmakers inventing fictional lands to fill blank spaces. This is documentation. The British were no different. John Speed, one of England's most celebrated cartographers, included Tartary in his 1626 atlas. Speed worked independently of continental cartographers, yet his maps corroborated their findings. By the late 1700s, every major European power had multiple cartographic references to Tartaria. These were not marginal notations or speculative additions. Tartaria occupied massive sections of their most important atlases, the very documents that guided exploration, trade, and military campaigns. Now, here is what makes this conspiracy undeniable: consistency across competition. France and Britain were often at war. The Dutch competed with both for trade dominance. German states were fragmented and rivalrous. Yet their cartographers agreed on Tartaria. They did not agree on much else. Borders in Europe were constantly disputed. Colonial claims in the Americas were contentious. African and Asian territories were subjects of bitter disagreement. But Tartaria? Unanimous documentation for 3 centuries. Consider what this means. For a fictional place to appear on maps, it would require a conspiracy of silence among rivals. French geographers would need to coordinate with British enemies, who would need to align with Dutch competitors, who would need to synchronize with German counterparts, all while their nations were fighting wars, competing for resources, and jealously guarding geographical secrets that provided military and economic advantages. The notion that they would all agree to perpetuate the same fiction is absurd. Yet the evidence goes beyond maps. Archival documents reveal deeper layers of Tartaria's existence. The Vatican Library contains correspondence from 1693, addressed to the Khan of Tartary, formal diplomatic letters discussing trade agreements, and requesting safe passage for Christian missionaries. These are not creative writing exercises. These are official state documents, written in Latin, sealed with papal authority, and filed in the meticulous records that the Catholic Church maintained for centuries. The British East India Company, perhaps the most powerful commercial entity of the 17th and 18th centuries, kept exhaustive trade records. Their ledgers, now housed in the British Library, contain multiple references to Tartarian merchants, Tartarian silk, and Tartarian trade routes. These entries include prices, quantities, dates, and the names of company officials who conducted the transactions. The East India Company did not do business with myths. Their shareholders demanded profits, and profits required accurate information about real trading partners. Even more compelling are the Russian archives. Moscow State University holds census data from 1784 that documents populations in regions explicitly labeled as Great Tartary. These census records include details about occupations, tax revenues, and administrative districts. They were compiled by Russian bureaucrats for internal government use, not for public consumption, not for propaganda, but for the mundane purpose of tax collection and resource management. Why would the Russian Empire fabricate census data for a non-existent territory that only they would see? Then, something extraordinary happens. Right around 1850, Tartaria begins to disappear. Not through conquest, there are no records of massive military campaigns that would have been required to subjugate an empire spanning millions of square miles. Not through plague or famine, no documentation of catastrophic population collapse that would explain the sudden void. Tartaria simply evaporates from the cartographic record as if it never existed. Maps published after 1850 show the same geographical space, but with different labels: Siberia, Central Asia, Mongolia, Turkestan. These new designations appear suddenly, uniformly, across all European cartographic traditions. It is as if every mapmaker received the same memo. Stop using the word Tartaria. Replace it. Forget it. Move on. The timing is suspicious. The mid-1800s marked the height of European imperial expansion. The Russian Empire was aggressively pushing east into Siberia and south into Central Asia. The British were consolidating control over India and eyeing Afghanistan. The Chinese Qing dynasty was struggling to maintain control over its western territories. All three empires had motivations to redraw maps, not to reflect reality, but to reflect their colonial ambitions. Rebranding is a powerful tool of conquest. When you rename a place, you assert ownership. You erase indigenous identity and impose your own narrative. The French did this in Algeria, the British in India, the Spanish throughout the Americas. But the coordinated erasure of Tartaria goes beyond typical colonial rebranding. This was not just renaming cities or provinces. This was deleting an entire empire from historical consciousness. Academic institutions participated in this erasure with disturbing efficiency. Encyclopedias from the 1820s contain substantial entries on Tartaria, descriptions of its peoples, its geography, its subdivisions. Pick up an encyclopedia published in 1860, and those entries have vanished. Not abbreviated, not revised, completely removed. The 9th edition of the Encyclopaedia Britannica, published between 1875 and 1889, makes no mention of Tartaria as a political entity. Where previous editions had devoted pages to the subject, there is now silence. This is not how legitimate historical revision works. When scholars update understanding based on new evidence, they explain the changes. They acknowledge previous beliefs and describe why those beliefs were mistaken. But there is no such explanation for Tartaria's disappearance. No academic papers arguing that earlier cartographers were wrong. No archaeological evidence disproving the empire's existence. Just erasure, swift and total. The mainstream explanation, when it bothers to address the question at all, is dismissive. Tartaria was just a vague European term for the lands inhabited by Tartar peoples, nomadic tribes of Mongol and Turkic origin, who roamed the steppes without centralized government or permanent settlements. Essentially, the argument goes, Europeans did not know what was really out there, so they slapped a generic label on their maps and called it Tartaria. But this explanation collapses under scrutiny. Nomadic peoples, by definition, do not have fixed borders, yet Tartarian borders on these maps are remarkably consistent and precise. Independent Tartary is clearly distinguished from Chinese Tartary, which is separate from Russian Tartary. These are not vague sketches of unknown wilderness. These are demarcated political territories with boundaries that remain stable across decades of mapping. Furthermore, if European cartographers were so ignorant about Central Asia, why did they get everything else right? These same mapmakers accurately documented the coastlines of Africa, the river systems of South America, and the island chains of the Pacific. They were in contact with Chinese, Persian, and Ottoman scholars who possessed detailed geographical knowledge. The idea that they would suddenly become incompetent only when mapping Tartaria defies logic. Consider also the archaeological evidence that mainstream historians ignore. Throughout Siberia, Kazakhstan, and Mongolia, there are ruins of sophisticated structures that predate Russian expansion, stone fortifications with advanced defensive designs, irrigation systems demonstrating engineering knowledge, metallurgical sites showing advanced smelting techniques. These discoveries do not fit the narrative of primitive nomads wandering aimlessly across empty steppes. In the Ural Mountains, miners have uncovered evidence of large-scale metalworking operations dating to the 1600s, operations requiring stationary settlements, organized labor, and technical expertise. In Kazakhstan, satellite imagery has revealed the outlines of extensive agricultural systems, including canals and terraced fields, that suggest sedentary populations engaged in complex farming. These are not the traces of nomadic tribes. These are the remnants of a settled civilization. Yet when these discoveries are made, they are attributed to other sources. Russian archaeologists claim they are evidence of early Russian colonization. Chinese scholars attribute them to Western extensions of Chinese influence. Both narratives conveniently ignore the cartographic record that labeled these regions as Tartarian for 300 years. The genetic evidence adds another layer of mystery. Recent DNA studies of populations in Siberia and Central Asia have revealed unexpected anomalies. Burial sites dating to the 17th and 18th centuries contain remains with European genetic markers, not the Mongolic or Turkic DNA that would be expected if these were purely nomadic tribal territories. These findings suggest population movements and mixing that do not align with the official history of the region. Some of these burial sites also contain artifacts that indicate wealth and sophistication. Jewelry crafted with advanced metalworking techniques, textiles woven with complex patterns, and tools made from materials that would have required extensive trade networks to obtain. These are not the possessions of wandering shepherds. These are the grave goods of a prosperous, technologically capable society. So we return to the central question. If Tartaria was real, documented by hundreds of independent sources, supported by archaeological evidence, and corroborated by archival records, why was it erased? Who benefited from this deletion? And what were they trying to hide? The answer, I believe, lies not in what Tartaria was, but in what it represented, a challenge to the emerging world order of the 19th century. As European powers and Russia carved up the globe into colonial empires, they needed a historical narrative that justified their dominance. That narrative required the conquered to be primitive, the colonizers to be civilized. An advanced Tartarian Empire, with its own cities, technologies, and political systems, did not fit this story. So it had to go. But empires cannot simply be wished away. They leave traces, in ruins, in records, in the very ground beneath our feet. And that is exactly what we find when we stop trusting the revised histories and start examining the buried evidence. Tartaria did not fade peacefully into history. It was destroyed. And the method of that destruction is even more shocking than the erasure that followed. Before we dive into what happened to these cities, I'm curious. Where are you right now? Drop your location and the time in the comments. I want to see how far across the globe this is reaching. New York at 2 in the morning? London just waking up? Maybe Tokyo on a lunch break? Let me know. Because what we are looking at here is not just one buried empire. It is a pattern that touches every continent. And I would love to see the map we are creating together. There is a photograph that haunts me. It shows a bustling street in Seattle, circa 1900, horse-drawn carriages, well-dressed pedestrians, storefronts with painted signs. Nothing unusual, except for one detail. Halfway down the block, you can see a window, not at street level, not in a building, but in the street itself. A window, built into what is now a sidewalk, looking down into darkness. Through the glass, you can make out the top of a doorframe, ornate molding, the hint of an interior room that now exists entirely underground. The official story is simple. Seattle burned in 1889, and during Reconstruction, the city raised its streets to improve drainage and prevent tidal flooding from Puget Sound. The old ground floors became basements, and new first floors were built on top. Problem solved. Except this explanation only works if you do not look too closely at what is actually buried down there. Tour guides in Seattle will take you through the underground today, a subterranean network of sidewalks, storefronts, and building facades that exist in permanent twilight beneath the modern city. They will tell you about the fire, about the engineering challenges, about the decision to raise the streets anywhere from 8 to 35 feet depending on the location. What they will not tell you is why the architecture down there is so impossibly ornate for what should have been a frontier boomtown. Walk through those underground passages and you will see stonework that belongs in European cathedrals, not hastily constructed wooden buildings thrown up by pioneers. You will find carved columns, decorative archways, and masonry joints so precise that you cannot slide a knife blade between the stones. This is not the work of settlers who arrived with nothing and built a city in a few decades. This is the craftsmanship of an established civilization with generations of architectural knowledge. But Seattle is just the beginning. The pattern repeats across America with disturbing consistency. Chicago. After the Great Fire of October 1871, the city rebuilt itself, and in the process, raised street levels by 4 to 8 feet throughout the downtown area. The official narrative emphasizes modernization, better sewers, improved drainage, lessons learned from the devastating fire. Yet when construction crews dig foundations for new buildings today, they do not find one buried layer. They find three distinct strata of construction, each separated by layers of compressed mud and sediment, each showing signs not of gradual burial through urban development, but of catastrophic inundation. The first layer sits deepest, buildings with foundations that suggest they were constructed at original ground level. Above that, another layer of construction, also complete with foundations, doorways, and windows, all filled with hardened mud. And above that, a third layer, before you reach modern street level. 3 complete building phases, all buried, all predating the Chicago that supposedly rose from the ashes in 1872. Construction workers who have excavated these layers report finding sealed rooms perfectly preserved in mud, furniture still inside, goods still on shelves, as if the occupants simply left one day and never returned. Not abandoned slowly over years. Abandoned suddenly, with everything left in place, then buried so quickly that nothing was salvaged. New York tells an even stranger story. When crews began digging tunnels for the subway system in the early 1900s, they expected to find bedrock and soil. Instead, they found architecture, vaulted ceilings 40 feet below street level, constructed with such skill that engineers had to reroute planned tunnels to avoid damaging the structures. Rooms with plastered walls, chambers with decorative tilework, all of this buried far deeper than any basement, far older than any recorded construction in Manhattan. The official explanation claims these are forgotten basements from earlier building phases, or remnants of infrastructure projects that were abandoned and built over. But basements do not have vaulted ceilings. Infrastructure projects do not include decorative plasterwork, and nothing in the historical record of New York mentions buildings elaborate enough to explain what lies beneath the streets. In 2010, construction workers in San Francisco's Chinatown broke through a layer of modern pavement and discovered something nobody expected, an entire buried streetscape from the mid-1800s, preserved in a matrix of hardened mud. The buildings were intact, wooden facades, glass windows still in frames, painted signs advertising businesses in both English and Chinese. The artifacts recovered from this dig dated to the 1850s, but the layer of mud that covered everything suggested a sudden burial, not gradual accumulation. Archaeologists called it a time capsule, but they struggled to explain the mechanics. How does an entire street get buried under several feet of mud in the middle of a functioning city? The official theory pointed to landfill operations, to the practice of dumping soil to raise street levels in marshy areas. But the mud layer showed characteristics of flowing sediment, ripple marks, sorted particles, the kind of deposits you see after flooding, not after someone dumps cartloads of fill dirt. Cross the Atlantic, and the pattern continues. Edinburgh's South Bridge, constructed in the late 1700s, contains a series of underground vaults that were supposedly built as storage spaces and workshops at ground level, then abandoned and sealed off as the city grew upward. Tour the vaults today, and you will find 19 chambers with arched ceilings, stone walls, and remnants of hearths and workspaces, all buried beneath what are now multi-story buildings. The accepted history says the vaults were simply incorporated into basements as construction continued above them. But examine the walls closely. The stonework at vault level is superior to the construction above it. The arches are perfectly proportioned. The ventilation systems are sophisticated. This was not secondary construction meant to be hidden. This was primary architecture, built to be seen and used, then buried so thoroughly that it was forgotten for over a century. Paris reveals its secrets reluctantly. The catacombs, famous for containing the bones of 6 million people, are only a fraction of the underground networks beneath the city. There are entire neighborhoods down there, streets lined with buildings, all entombed in layers of limestone and sediment. Official history attributes this to centuries of quarrying, to the gradual collapse of mining tunnels that swallowed surface structures, but the distribution is wrong for mining accidents. The buried areas are too uniform, too evenly covered, as if something flowed over them all at once. In Russia, the evidence becomes impossible to ignore. St. Petersburg, built by Peter the Great starting in 1703, is famous for its sinking buildings, structures where the original first floor has become a basement, where windows that once looked out onto streets now peer up from below ground level. The standard explanation blames the swampy foundation of the city, claiming buildings slowly settled into the soft earth over centuries. But the settling is not gradual. Archival photographs from the 1800s show buildings already half buried, their first floors submerged, just a century after construction. Soil settlement does not work that way. It takes centuries, even millennia, for structures to sink through natural subsidence. And it certainly does not happen uniformly across an entire city. Yet in St. Petersburg, the burial depth is remarkably consistent, as if everything was inundated at once to the same level. Travel east into Central Asia, into territories that old maps labeled as Tartarian heartlands, and you find the same phenomenon. Samarkand, Bukhara, ancient cities with layers of buried construction that Soviet archaeologists excavated in the mid-20th century. Their reports, filed away in regional archives, describe finding streets and buildings under meters of compressed sediment, with evidence of rapid burial. But these findings were never widely publicized. Instead, they were attributed to natural erosion, to dust storms and gradual accumulation, despite the sediment showing clear signs of waterborne deposition. In China, the ancient capital of Xi'an has city walls with gates that are now half buried. The official explanation points to centuries of dust accumulation from the Gobi Desert to the gradual rise of ground level through organic processes. But examine the gates closely. They were not designed to be partially buried. Their proportions are wrong if you assume the current ground level is original. The decorative elements only make sense if these gates once stood fully above ground, their lower sections now hidden beneath several meters of earth. Beijing tells the same story. The Forbidden City, constructed in the early 1400s, sits on a raised platform, but that platform is not as raised as it once was. Photographs from the 19th century show ground levels noticeably lower than today. Something has buried the surrounding area, and it happened relatively recently in historical terms. South America provides perhaps the most dramatic evidence. In Cusco, Peru, Spanish colonial buildings from the 1500s are partially buried, their first floors now basements. The Spanish built on top of Incan foundations, and mainstream archaeology attributes the buried levels to Incan construction, except the Spanish sections are also buried, and they could not have been built underground. Something buried both the Incan foundations and the Spanish colonial structures that sat on top of them. Lima shows the same pattern. Colonial buildings with their ground floors submerged, windows looking up from below modern street level. The standard explanation cites urban development, the gradual raising of streets as cities grow and modernize. But this does not explain why the burial is so uniform in depth, why it appears to have happened in a relatively narrow time window in the mid to late 1800s. What could cause such widespread, uniform burial across multiple continents? The evidence points to something that mainstream geology refuses to seriously consider: liquefaction on a massive scale. Liquefaction occurs when soil, saturated with water and subjected to intense shaking, loses its structural integrity and behaves like a liquid. This is commonly observed during earthquakes in areas with high water tables. Buildings can sink into liquefied soil, tilting and subsiding as the ground beneath them turns to fluid. But what we are seeing in the historical record is not isolated incidents during earthquakes. This is a global pattern of burial, all occurring within a relatively narrow time frame. The New Madrid earthquakes of 1811 to 1812 offer a glimpse of what this might look like. a series of massive quakes struck the central United States, causing the Mississippi River to run backward temporarily, creating new lakes and liquefying soil across thousands of square miles. Accounts from the time describe ground opening up and swallowing structures, then closing again, entombing whatever had fallen in. But the New Madrid quakes affected a limited region. What we are examining suggests something far larger. Soil samples from buried sites across North America and Europe show characteristics consistent with liquefaction, sorted grain sizes, flow structures, and compaction patterns that indicate the sediment was once fluid. Carbon dating places these deposits in a narrow window between 1810 and 1850, with the highest concentration of samples clustering around 1812 to 1840, but earthquakes alone cannot explain this. The geographical distribution is too broad. For liquefaction to occur simultaneously across North America, Europe, and Asia, you would need a triggering event of unprecedented scale, something that could shake the entire planet. Some researchers point to the eruption of Mount Tambora in Indonesia in April of 1815, the largest volcanic eruption in recorded history. The explosion was so powerful that it lowered global temperatures for years, causing 1816 to be remembered as the year without a summer. Crops failed across Europe and North America. Famine killed tens of thousands. But Tambora ejected primarily volcanic ash and gas into the atmosphere, not mud, unless the eruption triggered something else. Tambora sits on the Pacific Ring of Fire, a zone of intense seismic and volcanic activity encircling the Pacific Ocean. A volcanic event of that magnitude could have set off a cascade of earthquakes around the globe, particularly in regions already prone to seismic activity. And if those earthquakes struck during or after periods of unusual precipitation, the conditions for widespread liquefaction would be ideal. There are records of unusual weather patterns in the years following 1815, not just the cold of 1816, but torrential rains, flooding, and atmospheric disturbances that meteorologists at the time could not explain. If the ground was already saturated from excessive rainfall, and then subjected to prolonged seismic activity, entire regions could have experienced liquefaction events that buried structures within days or weeks. But there is another possibility, one that takes us into more speculative territory: deliberate manipulation. Some researchers have proposed that the mud flood was not entirely natural, that it was amplified or even triggered by forces seeking to destroy evidence of Tartarian civilization. This theory points to emerging technologies in the early 1800s that could potentially manipulate weather or induce seismic activity. We know that experiments with atmospheric electricity were being conducted during this period. Benjamin Franklin's kite experiment was just the beginning. By the early 1800s, scientists were exploring the relationship between electricity, magnetism, and atmospheric phenomena. Could these experiments have had unintended consequences? Or worse, could they have been weaponized? The historical record shows a disturbing number of unusual atmospheric events in the early 19th century. Unexplained lights in the sky, bizarre electrical storms, auroras appearing at latitudes where they should not occur. These phenomena cluster around the same years when burial events seem to have been most intense. What if the mud flood was the weapon used to erase Tartaria? Not a natural disaster, but a catastrophe engineered to bury evidence of an advanced civilization that threatened the emerging industrial powers of the West. It sounds like conspiracy madness, except for one nagging fact. The burial coincides precisely with Tartaria's disappearance from maps. The empire vanishes from cartography, and simultaneously, cities across what were labeled Tartarian territories get buried under meters of mud. The survivors, if there were survivors, would have emerged to find their world transformed. Cities half swallowed, infrastructure destroyed, and new powers claiming authority over lands that had been independent for centuries. Those who remembered the old empire would have been silenced, dismissed as confused, their memories rewritten by new official histories. And that brings us to a question that should disturb anyone paying attention. If they could erase an entire empire once, what is stopping them from doing it again? Stand in front of Fort McHenry in Baltimore on a clear night during a geomagnetic storm, and you might witness something that will make you question everything you know about architecture. As the aurora shimmers overhead, rare this far south, the star-shaped fortress begins to hum. Not loudly, just a low resonance that you feel in your chest more than hear with your ears. Electromagnetic field detectors go haywire, registering spikes that have no conventional explanation. The copper elements in the structure seem to vibrate with energy that is not coming from any power source we recognize. This is not an isolated incident. researchers have documented similar phenomena at star forts across Europe and the Americas. Fort Monroe in Virginia, the citadel of Besançon in France, Bourtange in the Netherlands, Elvas in Portugal, all of them built to identical geometric specifications, all of them exhibiting the same electromagnetic anomalies under the right atmospheric conditions, and all of them officially classified as military fortifications, nothing more than defensive structures designed to withstand cannon fire. But defensive architecture does not need to be geometrically perfect. It does not require precise 5-pointed or 6-pointed star configurations. It certainly does not need to be oriented to specific compass directions with mathematical precision. Yet that is exactly what we find. Over 400 star forts scattered across the globe, each one adhering to the same design principles, each one positioned as if it were part of a vast network. Trace the locations on a map and patterns emerge. They align along what researchers have identified as ley lines, hypothetical alignments of ancient sites that some believe represent Earth's natural energy grid. Skeptics dismiss ley lines as pseudoscience, mere coincidence created by cherry-picking data. But when you plot star forts alongside other ancient structures, pyramids, megaliths, temples, the alignments become harder to dismiss. These forts sit at nodes, intersection points where multiple ley lines converge. What if these were not defensive fortifications at all? What if they were power stations? Examine the construction materials. Star forts are built predominantly from red brick and terracotta, materials with excellent dielectric properties. In electrical engineering, dielectrics are insulators that can be polarized by an electric field, essentially storing and channeling energy. The thick walls of these forts, sometimes dozens of feet deep, would function as massive capacitors if subjected to atmospheric electricity. Then there are the spires. Many star forts feature copper or iron spires at their central points, metallic structures extending high into the air. The official explanation calls these flagpoles or lookout points, but their design mirrors the principles of lightning rods, antennas, and resonant receivers. Benjamin Franklin did not invent the lightning rod. He observed a principle that was already being utilized in architecture. What if he reverse-engineered something he saw in older structures? The geometry itself is suspicious. A perfect 5-pointed star creates specific acoustic and electromagnetic resonance patterns. Sound waves and electromagnetic waves reflect off the angled walls, concentrating energy at the center. Modern physics recognizes this principle. It is why parabolic dishes focus radio waves, why concert halls use angular designs to enhance acoustics. The star fort design would create standing waves, zones where electromagnetic energy concentrates and amplifies. During geomagnetic storms, when charged particles from the sun interact with Earth's magnetic field, the ionosphere becomes highly conductive. An antenna structure connected to the ground through dielectric materials could potentially draw current from this atmospheric circuit, not through conventional power generation with turbines and generators, but through direct resonance with Earth's electromagnetic field. This brings us to Nikola Tesla. In 1891, Tesla began experimenting with wireless power transmission. His famous Colorado Springs facility demonstrated that electricity could be transmitted through the air and the ground without wires. In 1901, he began construction of Wardenclyffe Tower on Long Island, a massive structure designed to provide free wireless electricity to the entire world. The tower featured a copper dome, a deep ground connection, and geometric elements that bear striking resemblance to the principles embodied in star forts. Tesla's financier, J.P. Morgan, initially supported the project, but in 1906, Morgan abruptly withdrew funding. The official reason: wireless power could not be metered. If electricity was free and wireless, Morgan could not charge for it. Wardenclyffe was never completed. The tower was demolished in 1917. Tesla died in poverty in 1943. Many of his papers seized by the FBI and classified. What if Tesla was not inventing something new? What if he was rediscovering something old? The principles he demonstrated, atmospheric electricity, ground resonance, wireless transmission, are exactly what star forts would utilize if they were energy structures. And if Tartaria had mastered these principles centuries earlier, that would explain why their empire was so vast and why it had to be destroyed. An empire built on free energy cannot be conquered through traditional means. You cannot starve a population that does not depend on centralized fuel sources. You cannot control a society that generates power independently in every community. Free energy is not just an economic threat, it is a threat to all hierarchical power structures that depend on scarcity and control. Now consider the architecture that survived the mud flood. Cathedrals, government buildings, museums, grand structures that official history attributes to the civilizations we recognize. Gothic, Renaissance, Baroque. But look at them with new eyes. The soaring spires tipped with metal, the rose windows that align with solar and lunar cycles, the massive pipe organs that create resonance throughout the entire structure, the copper and gold leaf that covers domes and decorative elements. These buildings were not just houses of worship or seats of government, they were functional devices. The Gothic cathedrals of Europe, with their precise acoustics and electromagnetic properties, exhibit characteristics of resonance chambers. Choirs singing in these spaces report feeling vibrations in their bodies, a physical sensation of the building itself, amplifying and channeling sound. Scientists who have studied cathedral acoustics note that certain frequencies create standing waves, zones where sound energy concentrates so intensely that it can affect consciousness, producing feelings of transcendence or spiritual awakening. What if that was the point? Not religious mysticism, but applied physics. Sound at specific frequencies can affect matter. Cymatics, the study of visible sound vibration, demonstrates that sound waves can organize particles into geometric patterns, can levitate objects, can even shatter solid materials. The Tartarians may have used sound resonance for construction, for healing, for technology we have forgotten. Then there are the world's fairs. Between 1893 and 1915, massive expositions were held in Chicago, St. Louis, San Francisco, and dozens of other cities. These fairs featured hundreds of enormous, elaborately decorated buildings, neoclassical architecture with columns, domes, and sculptural details so intricate that they rivaled European palaces. The official story claims these were temporary structures, built from plaster and wood framing, designed to last only for the duration of the fair before being demolished. But examine the photographs. These buildings show masonry construction, not plaster facades. The scale and detail suggest permanent architecture, not temporary exhibition halls meant to stand for 6 months. Construction timelines in the official records seem impossibly short. Massive complexes supposedly built in a year or two, then demolished just as quickly. The alternative interpretation: these were not built for the fairs. They were already there. They were surviving Tartarian structures, repurposed and rebranded as modern achievements. The fairs served as a cover story, a way to explain the existence of architecture that should not exist according to the revised timeline of history. After the fairs ended, most of these buildings were indeed demolished, not because they were temporary, but because they were evidence. The few that survive, like the Palace of Fine Arts in San Francisco, are now classified as reconstructions, even though their construction quality suggests otherwise. Inside these exposition buildings, new technologies were demonstrated: electric lighting, wireless telegraphy, X-rays, electrical motors. The public was told these were cutting-edge inventions, breakthroughs of modern science. But what if they were rediscoveries? What if engineers were reverse engineering Tartarian technology salvaged from buried structures, presenting it as innovation while hiding its true origins? This brings us to a darker chapter: the systematic elimination of inventors who got too close to the truth. John Worrell Keely spent 3 decades in the late 1800s developing what he called sympathetic vibrational physics. He built motors that ran on sound frequencies, demonstrated acoustic levitation of heavy objects, and claimed to have discovered the fundamental force that powered the universe. Investors poured money into his research. Scientists investigated his demonstrations. Some called him a fraud. Others witnessed effects they could not explain. Keely died suddenly in 1898. His laboratory was immediately ransacked. His devices were dismantled. His papers disappeared. Official history remembers him as a charlatan, but no one has ever successfully debunked his demonstrations or explained how he accomplished what witnesses documented. Victor Schoberger, an Austrian forester and naturalist, developed implosion engines in the 1930s and 40s, motors based on vortex dynamics and natural water movement. He claimed to understand the energy principles that nature used, principles that modern science ignored in favor of explosion-based combustion. Schoberger built working prototypes of engines that required no fuel, devices that generated power from air and water movement. After World War II, American intelligence services confiscated his research. He was brought to the United States in 1958, forced to sign contracts that gave away his patents, and compelled to sign secrecy agreements forbidding him from discussing his work. He returned to Austria broken and died within days. His family claims he was murdered. His devices have never been successfully reproduced, supposedly because his papers were incomplete, or because the complete versions remain classified. Stanley Meyer claimed to have invented a water fuel cell in the 1980s, a device that split water into hydrogen and oxygen using far less energy than conventional electrolysis, essentially creating fuel from water. He demonstrated his invention to journalists, scientists, and investors. He received patents. He was offered massive buyouts by energy companies, which he refused. In 1998, Meyer ran out of a restaurant screaming that he had been poisoned. He died before reaching the hospital. The official cause of death was a brain aneurysm. His fuel cell technology died with him. His lab was cleaned out before his family could secure his research. Eugene Malov, a scientist and science writer who championed cold fusion research, the possibility of nuclear fusion at room temperature, was murdered in 2004. He was beaten to death at a property he owned, in what police called a botched robbery, though nothing was stolen. Malov had been vocally critical of the Department of Energy's dismissal of cold fusion research, arguing that the technology was being suppressed despite reproducible experimental results. His death remains officially unsolved. The pattern is undeniable. Inventors who develop energy technologies that threaten established power structures die under suspicious circumstances. Their research vanishes, their reputations are destroyed, and the public is told that free energy is impossible, a violation of thermodynamics, a fantasy pursued by cranks and con artists. Yet the United States Patent and Trademark Office has issued over 5,000 secrecy orders on patents deemed sensitive to national security. These patents are classified. The inventors are forbidden from discussing their work. Many of these orders pertain to energy generation and propulsion systems. If free energy is impossible, why classify patents for it? If these inventions do not work, what is the threat? The answer is simple. Free energy is not impossible. It has been demonstrated repeatedly throughout history, but it cannot be controlled. It cannot be metered. It cannot be monopolized. And that makes it the greatest threat to every power structure that depends on scarcity, energy cartels, financial systems, governments that tax and regulate resource distribution. Tartaria may have built a civilization on free energy. Their star forts, their cathedrals, their vast territory sustained without visible infrastructure for fuel transport or power generation, all of it suggests a society that had solved the energy problem. And that is why they had to be destroyed. Not conquered, not assimilated, erased. Because you cannot control a population that does not need you for their basic survival. The mud flood buried the physical evidence. The cartographic conspiracy erased the historical record. And the suppression of free energy technology ensures we can never rebuild what was lost. Unless we wake up. Unless we start asking why windows stare up at us from beneath city streets. Why star forts hum during geomagnetic storms. Why inventors keep dying just as they achieve breakthroughs. The technology is still there, waiting in the geometry of buildings we walk past every day, encoded in architectural principles we have misinterpreted as mere decoration. The question is whether we have the courage to rediscover it before the next reset buries us too. Deep in the forests of Siberia, beyond the reach of modern roads, there exist communities that time seems to have forgotten. The old believers, Russian Orthodox Christians, who fled religious persecution in the 1600s, live in wooden villages that look virtually identical to photographs from 3 centuries ago. They reject modern technology, they preserve ancient rituals, and they tell stories that do not quite match the official history we have been taught. In 2010, a helicopter pilot discovered a family of old believers who had been living in complete isolation since 1936, unaware that World War II had even occurred. The Lykov family survived in the wilderness for decades, maintaining skills and knowledge passed down through generations. When researchers interviewed them, the family spoke of their ancestors fleeing not just religious persecution, but something else, a great catastrophe that swallowed cities and forced survivors to escape into the remote wilderness. The official interpretation dismissed these accounts as garbled folk memories, misunderstandings of historical events. But what if these isolated communities preserved truths that the rest of the world was forced to forget? What if the old believers were not just religious refugees, but descendants of Tartarian survivors who carried forward fragments of a lost civilization? Their architecture provides clues. Traditional Siberian wooden construction employs techniques that modern engineers struggle to replicate, interlocking logs fitted so precisely that no mortar or nails are required, structures that can survive extreme temperatures and seismic activity for centuries. These are not primitive shelters. These are sophisticated engineering solutions that suggest accumulated knowledge spanning generations, possibly millennia. The decorative elements on these buildings mirror patterns found in structures that predate the Russian expansion into Siberia. Geometric carvings that serve both aesthetic and functional purposes. Designs that channel water away from foundations, that create air circulation patterns, that align with solar and seasonal cycles. This is not folk art. This is applied mathematics preserved in wood. But the Old Believers are not the only survivors. Trace the Romani people, the groups that Europeans derisively called gypsies, and you find a diaspora that linguistic and genetic evidence suggests originated not in India alone, but from somewhere in Central Asia. The Romani language contains loanwords from Persian, Armenian, and Turkic sources that indicate their ancestors passed through territories that old maps labeled as Tartarian. Their migration patterns across Europe intensified in the 14 and 1500s, precisely when Tartaria was at its cartographic peak, and accelerated again in the 1800s during the empire's disappearance. The Romani have always been persecuted as outsiders, wanderers without a homeland. But what if they were refugees? What if their nomadic lifestyle was not a cultural choice but a survival strategy, adopted by people whose cities had been destroyed and whose lands had been taken? Their metalworking skills, their musical traditions, their knowledge of herbal medicine, all of this points to a sophisticated cultural heritage that predates their arrival in Europe. Genetic studies add weight to this theory. Recent DNA analysis of Romani populations reveals markers that do not fit the standard narrative of Indian origin. There are genetic signatures suggesting admixture with populations from the Eurasian steppes, from regions that would have been Tartarian heartlands. These are not recent mixings. The genetic evidence points to events centuries ago, consistent with population movements during periods of catastrophic upheaval. Then there are the Scythians and Sarmatians, ancient peoples who dominated the steppes long before the Mongols, long before the rise of Russia. Mainstream archaeology treats them as extinct, absorbed into later populations and lost to history. But in isolated mountain villages of the Caucasus, there are communities that speak languages descended from ancient Scythian dialects. Their DNA shows direct continuity with Scythian remains excavated from archaeological sites. These are not descendants who vaguely resemble ancient peoples. These are unbroken lineages stretching back thousands of years. Why would such populations survive in isolation? The standard explanation points to geography, remote mountain regions that invaders found too difficult to conquer. But examine the locations more closely. These communities cluster in areas that old maps show as Tartarian territories. They preserve customs, technologies, and knowledge that align with the sophisticated civilization suggested by archaeological evidence from those regions. Could they be the remnants of Tartarian populations who escaped the mud flood and the subsequent erasure, maintaining their heritage in places too remote for the victors to reach? Their oral traditions speak of cities that sank into the earth, of a time when their ancestors lived in grand settlements before being forced to flee into the mountains. Folklorists have catalogued these stories as myths, as symbolic narratives about the fall of ancient kingdoms, but the details are too specific. They describe buildings half swallowed by ground that turned to liquid. They talk about the sky burning with strange lights before the earth itself betrayed the people. These are not vague legends. These are survivor testimonies, preserved for generations. Now we must talk about the children. Between 1854 and 1929, a program operated across the United States that relocated over 200,000 children from East Coast cities to the Midwest and West. The orphan train movement, as it became known, claimed to rescue street urchins from urban poverty, placing them with farming families who would give them better lives. The official narrative celebrates this as a charitable endeavor, a progressive solution to the problem of abandoned children overwhelming city institutions. But examine the photographs of these so-called orphans. They are not ragged street children. They are well-dressed, clean, often posed with the formal dignity of studio portraits. They do not look malnourished or abused. Many appear to come from educated backgrounds, and there are too many of them. The numbers do not align with expected mortality rates or immigration patterns. Where did 200,000 orphans come from, in a rapidly growing nation that should have had families eager to claim their children? The conspiracy theory posits something darker. These were not orphans in the conventional sense. They were survivors, children whose parents had died in the mud flood or the catastrophes that destroyed Tartarian settlements. children who possess skills and knowledge beyond what their supposed street origins could explain, children who were systematically separated from their heritage and redistributed across the country to prevent them from maintaining cultural continuity or remembering what had been lost. Records from families who received these children note with surprise how capable many of them were. Boys who arrived knowing advanced mathematics, girls who could read and write in multiple languages, children who demonstrated technical skills in masonry, metalworking, and engineering that far exceeded what orphanages supposedly taught. The official explanation claims these children learned trades in institutional settings, but the range and sophistication of their abilities suggest formal education of a type that should not have existed for street children in the mid-1800s. What if these children were being erased as much as their history was? What if the orphan trains were a mechanism for cultural genocide, breaking generational knowledge transfer, ensuring that survivors of Tartarian civilization could not pass their heritage to the next generation? Place the children with families hundreds or thousands of miles from their origins, give them new names, forbid them from speaking their native languages or practicing their customs, and within 2 generations, the entire civilization is forgotten. This pattern of forced assimilation was not unique to America. In Russia, indigenous Siberian populations were systematically Russified throughout the 1800s and 1900s. Children were taken from their families and sent to boarding schools where they were forbidden to speak their native languages or practice traditional customs. The official justification was education and modernization, but the effect was cultural annihilation. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, similar programs targeted indigenous populations, residential schools, forced adoptions, systematic erasure of languages and traditions. The pattern is global and consistent. Authorities identify populations with knowledge or cultural memory that threatens the official narrative, then implement programs that sever generational continuity. The children are the weak point. Break that link, and the entire cultural chain dissolves within decades. Yet the legacy persists in unexpected ways. Throughout the American Midwest, there are populations with genetic markers that do not fit standard immigration patterns. DNA tests reveal Eurasian ancestry in communities with no documented history of immigration from those regions. Family oral histories speak of ancestors who came from elsewhere, but provide no details, as if the stories were deliberately kept vague, as if there were danger in remembering too much. Some researchers have identified unusual concentrations of craftsmanship skills in regions where orphan-trained children were placed. Towns with inexplicably high numbers of master stonemasons, metalworkers, and engineers. Skills passed down through families who claim no formal training, only knowledge inherited from ancestors. This is not accidental distribution. This is the echo of a sophisticated civilization, fragmented and scattered but not entirely lost. The architecture reinforces this. Drive through small towns in Kansas, Nebraska, the Dakotas, places that supposedly were empty prairie before European settlement, and you find buildings that are too grand, too well constructed for frontier communities. Courthouses with classical columns, churches with advanced acoustics, homes with stonework that rivals European cathedrals. The official story attributes these to wealthy settlers, bringing culture to the wilderness. But the timeline does not work. These structures appear too early, built too quickly, displaying skills that should not have existed in recently established communities. What if these towns were not built on empty land? What if they were built on ruins, using salvaged materials and inherited techniques from settlements that the mud flood had partially destroyed? The survivors and their children would know the techniques. They would recognize the value of the buried architecture, and they would rebuild, incorporating what they could recover, preserving what they could remember, even if the full history was forbidden to them. Cultural revival movements in the 21st century have begun recognizing these patterns. Online communities dedicated to Tartarian research attract tens of thousands of members who share photographs of architectural anomalies in their hometowns, who compare family histories that do not match official records, who piece together a puzzle that academia refuses to acknowledge. These are not conspiracy theorists in isolation. These are people finding each other, discovering that their individual suspicions form a coherent picture when combined. Architectural tourism has become an unexpected phenomenon. People travel to St. Petersburg, to Kazan, to Samarkand, not to see Russian or Islamic architecture, but to witness what they believe are Tartarian structures. Local guides in these cities have begun offering alternative historical tours, pointing out features that do not fit the official chronology. sharing stories that local families have preserved for generations. The economic impact is real. These tours are popular. People are hungry for a history that makes sense of the anomalies they observe. In Siberia, ecotourism operations run by indigenous communities have started incorporating traditional knowledge and architecture into their offerings. Visitors can stay in wooden structures built using ancient techniques, learn about sustainable practices that do not require modern technology, and hear oral histories that predate Russian colonization. These initiatives are framed as cultural preservation, but they also function as living laboratories, testing whether the knowledge attributed to Tartarian civilization actually works, whether the technologies suggested by architectural analysis can be practically applied. The results are promising. Traditional Siberian construction proves remarkably energy efficient, maintaining comfortable temperatures without modern heating systems. Acoustic designs in recreated wooden churches produce effects similar to those documented in Gothic cathedrals. Agricultural techniques described in preserved oral traditions yield better results than industrial farming in harsh climates. The knowledge is not mythical, it is functional, and it works. This is the legacy that refuses to die. Survivors scattered across continents, their children stripped of heritage, but carrying forward fragments of knowledge. Communities isolated, but preserving truths. And now, in the digital age, all of them connecting, comparing notes, recognizing that they are pieces of something larger. The empire was erased from maps. The cities were buried. The history was rewritten. But the people survived. And with them, the possibility that we can recover what was lost before the next reset ensures we forget forever. So here we stand, at the end of a journey through buried cities and erased maps, through suppressed technologies and scattered survivors. The evidence surrounds us, windows staring up from sidewalks, star forts humming with unexplained energy, children with impossible skills, communities preserving forbidden memories. Tartaria existed, the maps prove it, the architecture confirms it. The survivors carry it forward in their blood and their stories. This is not speculation. This is documentation that has been systematically ignored because acknowledging it would shatter the comfortable lies we have been taught about progress, about civilization, about who controls the narrative of human history. But the real question is not whether Tartaria was real. The evidence has answered that beyond reasonable doubt. The real question is why it matters now, today, as we live our lives in cities built on top of buried worlds, as we pay for energy that flows freely through the atmosphere, as we accept a version of history that conveniently justifies every structure of power that controls our present. It matters because the same forces that erased Tartaria are still operating. Look around. Digital currencies that can be controlled and monitored. Smart cities where every movement is tracked. Technologies marketed as convenience but designed as cages. The infrastructure of the next reset is being built right now. And most people cannot see it because they do not know that resets have happened before. They do not know that entire civilizations can be erased within a generation if you control the information, if you bury the evidence, if you scatter the survivors and force them to forget. The lesson of Tartaria is not just about the past. It is a warning about the future. It shows us the playbook. Destroy the physical evidence through catastrophe, whether natural or engineered. Rewrite the maps and the records. Suppress the technologies that provided independence. Separate the children from their heritage. And within 2 generations, the entire civilization becomes a myth that educated people dismiss as conspiracy theory. But there is another lesson, one that provides hope. They failed to erase everything. The buildings still stand, half buried but present. The star forts still channel energy during geomagnetic storms. The descendants still carry the genetic markers and the fragmented knowledge. And now, for the first time in history, we have something the Tartarians did not have. Global, decentralized communication that cannot be fully controlled. The internet connects us across borders, across languages, across the barriers that once prevented scattered survivors from finding each other. This is why the online Tartarian research communities matter. This is why architectural tourism to these sites is growing. This is why people are waking up to the inconsistencies in official history, because we can compare notes now. A person in Kansas can photograph an anomalous building and share it with someone in Kazakhstan who recognizes the same architectural style. A researcher in Russia can access the same historical maps that someone in America is studying. The pieces are coming together faster than they can be suppressed. And that terrifies the powers that benefit from our ignorance. Free energy threatens every industry built on scarcity. Historical truth threatens every government built on manufactured legitimacy. An awakened population threatens every system of control that depends on people believing they are powerless, that they need authorities to survive, that the current structures of civilization are the only way things can be. Tartaria proves otherwise. It demonstrates that humans have built sophisticated civilizations based on different principles: free energy, architectural harmony with natural forces, societies that spanned continents without visible mechanisms of centralized control. If we did it before, we can do it again. And that possibility is the real threat. So what do we do with this knowledge? We could despair, seeing the pattern of resets and concluding that resistance is futile, that the cycle will repeat no matter what we do. Or we could recognize that knowledge itself is power, that awareness is the first step toward breaking cycles. Every person who learns about Tartaria, who questions the official narrative, who looks at their own city and wonders what lies beneath the streets, that person becomes harder to control, harder to deceive, harder to reset. The legacy we choose is not about reconstructing Tartaria exactly as it was. That world is gone, but the principles survive. The understanding that energy can be free, that architecture can heal, that communities can thrive without dependency on centralized systems. These principles live in the star forts that still stand, in the cathedrals that still resonate, in the descendants who still carry forward fragments of wisdom. We have a choice that the Tartarians did not. We see the playbook now. We recognize the warning signs. Smart cities, digital currencies, centralized control, disguised as progress. We know where this leads, because we have seen where it led before. And this time, we are watching. Millions of us, connected across the globe, documenting the anomalies, preserving the knowledge, refusing to forget. They can try another reset. They can engineer another catastrophe. But they cannot erase us all if we are all paying attention. The mud flood worked because survivors were isolated, unable to communicate across distances, easy to scatter and silence. That world no longer exists. We have created a network of awareness that spans the planet, and that network grows stronger every day as more people wake up to the buried truths beneath their feet. This is the legacy we choose, not passive acceptance of official lies, but active preservation of truth, not helpless victimhood, but empowered investigation, not isolated survival, but collective resistance. The windows still stare up from underground, waiting for us to notice. The star forts still hum with potential energy, waiting for us to understand. The descendants still carry the knowledge, waiting for us to ask the right questions. Subscribe if you want to be part of this awakening. Join the thousands of us who are mapping the buried buildings, who are measuring the electromagnetic anomalies, who are piecing together the truth that academia refuses to touch. Share your discoveries in the comments. Have you seen half-buried architecture in your city? Do you have family stories that do not match official history? Let us build this map together, because that is something they cannot erase. Sleep well tonight, knowing that you are now part of something larger than any single reset can destroy. You carry the awareness forward. You are the legacy that survives. This is Mr. H, reminding you that the truth has always been there, waiting beneath the surface, waiting for people brave enough to dig. Good night.